In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro delivers a detailed analysis of what he calls one of the most magnificent foreign policy achievements of recent times: the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, effectively ending a brutal 12-day conflict. Shapiro highlights President Donald Trump's pivotal role in brokering this peace, emphasizing that the war, which had the potential to devastate the Middle East for years, was brought to a swift and decisive conclusion. Trump's announcement on Truth Social marked the official end of hostilities, with a carefully coordinated ceasefire timeline between the two nations. Shapiro praises the president's ability to secure this outcome without a single American casualty, framing it as a masterstroke of statecraft and a massive victory for both Israel and the United States. Shapiro provides an in-depth account of the military operations that led to this ceasefire. He credits Israel, with American backing, for the large-scale destruction of Iran's ballistic missile infrastructure and the elimination of key figures within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, including top nuclear scientists. The United States, under Trump's authorization, executed a critical B-2 stealth bomber strike on Iran's Fordo nuclear facility, a move Shapiro describes as courageous and decisive. This strike, combined with Israeli efforts, set back Iran's nuclear ambitions by at least a decade, if not permanently, by destroying centrifuges, factories, and scientific expertise necessary for uranium enrichment. Shapiro underscores the unprecedented nature of this success, achieved without American troop casualties, and lauds it as a defining moment in Trump's presidency. Despite the ceasefire, Shapiro notes that Iran launched a symbolic missile attack on a U.S. airbase in Qatar, which was pre-coordinated with American officials to minimize casualties and maintain an exit strategy for all parties involved. This mirrored a similar tactic used in 2020 following the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Trump's response on Truth Social was dismissive of Iran's missile barrage, highlighting the ineffectiveness of the strikes and the early warning that prevented any American casualties. Shapiro interprets this as Iran's last gasp, aimed more at domestic propaganda than genuine military retaliation. He also points out the irony of Iran apologizing to Qatar for the missile attack, underscoring the limited threat Iran posed in this conflict. The ceasefire was not without its violations. Shapiro recounts how Iran fired missiles into southern and northern Israel just before and after the ceasefire took effect, resulting in civilian casualties. Israel responded with strikes against Iranian targets, including a powerful pre-ceasefire attack in Tehran. President Trump publicly admonished both sides, particularly Israel, for continuing hostilities after the ceasefire was declared, urging restraint and emphasizing the importance of honoring the agreement. Shapiro interprets Trump's intervention as a necessary enforcement of peace, demonstrating his commitment to ending the conflict and preventing further escalation. The episode details how, following a phone call between Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israel ceased further strikes, solidifying the ceasefire's stability. Shapiro touches on the international ramifications of the conflict, including Russia's initial threat to supply nuclear weapons to Iran, which was quickly retracted after Trump's pointed public response. He stresses that despite Iran's public vows to rebuild its nuclear program, the destruction wrought during the conflict has left the regime severely crippled. Shapiro warns that any attempt by Iran to renuclearize will be met with swift action from both the United States and Israel, who remain vigilant through intelligence and covert operations. He draws a historical parallel to Israel's 1981 destruction of Iraq's Osirak reactor, which permanently ended Saddam Hussein's nuclear ambitions, suggesting a similar outcome may be in store for Iran. A significant portion of the episode is devoted to addressing the widespread criticism and misinformation surrounding the conflict and Trump's role. Shapiro highlights the stark contrast between the reality of the successful military campaign and the dire predictions made by prominent media figures, particularly Tucker Carlson. Carlson and others had warned that any strike on Iran would lead to catastrophic war, thousands of American deaths, and economic collapse. Shapiro methodically debunks these claims, pointing out that none of the predicted disasters materialized. He accuses these critics of ideological bias, neo-isolationism, and even tacit support for Iran's nuclear ambitions, framing their opposition as a betrayal of American interests and the MAGA movement. Shapiro also critiques the horseshoe theory dynamic, where both far-left and far-right factions opposed Trump's actions for different reasons, but ultimately undermined American foreign policy coherence. Shapiro turns a critical eye toward the radical left, exposing their support for terrorist organizations and anti-Israel rhetoric. He discusses the case of Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian activist at Columbia University who was previously targeted for deportation by the Trump administration due to his support for Hamas. Khalil's release and subsequent campus protests celebrating terrorism are cited as emblematic of the left's dangerous embrace of extremist views. Shapiro also highlights the National Students for Justice in Palestine's inflammatory statements, which frame the U.S. and Israel as imperialist aggressors and call for the dismantling of the American state. This radicalism, Shapiro warns, is gaining traction in democratic politics, exemplified by the rise of Zohran Mamdani, a New York City mayoral candidate with a history of supporting socialist policies, anti-police rhetoric, and pro-terrorist activism. Shapiro paints Mamdani as a symbol of the left's descent into extremism, warning of the consequences for cities like New York if such candidates gain power. The episode also touches on the international dimension of the conflict's aftermath, noting large-scale protests across Europe in support of Iran and against the U.S. and Israel. Shapiro describes these demonstrations as part of a broader trend of civilizational self-sabotage, where European populations and elites embrace anti-Semitic and anti-American sentiments. He recounts his recent visit to Rome, where anti-Israel graffiti and protests were prevalent, underscoring the challenges facing Western unity and the global order. These protests, Shapiro argues, reveal the ideological fault lines that complicate efforts to maintain peace and security in the Middle East and beyond. Ben Shapiro concludes by reaffirming his view that President Trump's handling of the Israel-Iran conflict represents the most successful foreign policy achievement of his lifetime. Trump's pragmatic, reality-based approach avoided the pitfalls of endless nation-building and catastrophic war, instead delivering a decisive blow to Iran's nuclear ambitions while preserving American lives and interests. Shapiro criticizes those who doubted Trump's resolve or foresaw disaster, urging listeners to reconsider their sources and perspectives. He also warns of the domestic political consequences of the left's radicalism and the importance of vigilance against those who would undermine American strength and values. The episode closes with a call to recognize the triumph of peace through strength and to support leadership that prioritizes American security and global stability.